Good morning, everybody. My name is Jim Rosler. I'm president of the European American Chamber of Commerce in New York and also managing partner of the law firm of Pepper Hamilton here in New York as well. I want to welcome you on a rainy Tuesday morning in a crowded city. Thank you for coming. We have a very interesting program this morning. It's a long day. Eduardo Porter is a columnist of the New York Times. Will interview Pierre Moscovici, who's got a very busy mandate with the EU, covering the economy, taxation, customs, and all the things that are lively today. So thank you, and I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. I don't know if this mic is working. Yeah. So it's a pleasure here to be in conversation with Mr. Moscovici. Very, very happy to be talking here with you. And it's happy to have you not only as a representative of the European Commission, but as a representative of Europe's political establishment. I mean, you were Minister of Finance in France under President Hollande. You were Minister for Europe way back when in the days of Jacques Chirac. So you are pretty much the political establishment, and this is the political establishment that is being challenged by the uprise in populism across the continent. And so, as a representative of the European political establishment, my question is, with European elections coming up, will the establishment hold, or is this wave of anti-establishment populism, does it still have power in it to disrupt Europe's politics?
Thank you for welcoming me so warmly as a member of the old establishment. Well, I feel suddenly as an elephant, as an old man, but it's true that I'm for a long time in politics. I'm first very pleased to be here in this conversation with you, Eduardo, and the invitation of the Chamber. I'm at Harvard Club, then I will go to Columbia, which for a Frenchman, a European is such an honor. I can't even resist to say my pleasure. But to jump directly to the answer. It's clear that we will have challenging times in 2019 with these European elections, which are probably going to be the most important and most delicate of the history of those elections. The European Parliament is elected only since 1979, 40 years old. Until then, it was a collection of national MPs. Now it's a direct vote. And until now, the situation was quite clear with the establishment. I would say basically two parties dominated European governance. On the one hand, the Christian Democrats from the Popular Party, let's say center-right, and the PES, let's say Social Democrats, center-left. And both of them were implicitly allied to govern Europe. What is quite sure is that the next parliament will be very different, and that those two parties together won't have the majority. So we will have at least a more delicate and difficult governance. Does this mean that the establishment will be wiped out? Certainly, people don't like the establishment, and there is a climate of what we call dégagisme in Europe, which sometimes takes the form of populism, or in my country, France, another form. I call that, some political scientists call that velvet populism, because it's a very polite way to tell the right and the left, you have to go. And that's what happened, but from a guy who himself is an insider, President Macron, which is very different from what happened here in this country or in Italy or here or there. So the establishment is certainly going to be disputed, but I would say that I think the pro-Europeans are still going to be the majority, even if reduced, that they are going to resist populism, but that the situation will be much more complex in fragmented parliament, with people who will be close to populism, also coming from the center-right, with people from the extreme left, which will be stronger. So it's a more complicated Europe. And to secure that result, we first need to resist populism, to combat populism, not with establishment arguments, but with the idea that Europe needs to change. And we need to understand that. And those of us who have a bit of experience, which certainly is my case, I was elected 25 years ago in the European Parliament, as was minister 21 years ago before the EU enlarged, and I was again minister 6 years ago, and I'm still a commissioner. We've got to understand that there is a need for a change, and that we have to address the issues raised by our EU citizens, inequalities, migration, democracy, respect of the rule of law. We must listen to that.
Yes, and changing on that, what kind of direction do you think these changes should be? So, for instance, you mentioned immigration. And my kind of like coarse understanding of the to call it something, the populist wave, is that it's very much reacting to immigration in some way, and the demand seems to be to curtail immigration, to block immigration. So is that how you see, say, European policy moving, or is there another solution?
I think we need to look at the root causes of this political crisis, which is certainly deriving to anti-migrants' attitude. To tell that clearly, first, European economy is getting much better than 10 years ago. Growth is there, public finances are sustainable, we have a stronger banking sector, maybe we can come back to that later on. So we basically are out of the economic crisis. We are in a cycle not only of recovery, but of expansion for a few years now. And I tell that because I'm here invited by the Chamber, dear Jim. The EU is a safe place to invest and a secure place to invest. And all of you are welcome there. So the economic crisis is over, but the legacies of the crisis are still there. And I would say, basically, it's about inequalities. And when a lot of people feel leftovers from the labor market or from globalization, then they tend to bring themselves to their own status. They tend to move nationalist, and they tend to have an anti-migrant reaction. Why do I say that? Because there is no migration crisis in Europe. The number of migrants entering illegally in Europe is now very reduced if you even compare to what it was in 2015. But there is a perception that people are threatened by migration. How can we address that? Certainly not by sharing the positions of the anti-migration parties. You cannot resist populists by being populist light. This is something I refuse. And I think it is a mistake, because people always prefer the original to the copy. If you sound a bit like Salvini or a bit like Le Pen, then people will vote for Le Pen or Salvini and not for you. So you need to clearly stick to your value. What are your values? The values of the Europeans is that we are open societies and we are open economies. I myself, I'm French, but my father came in France as a refugee just after the war from Romania. My mother was Polish for origin. Her parents were born in Poland, and I became a minister. This is also a country which is not a melting pot like the US, but which has this kind of tradition to integrate. We must not forget this. And so when somebody is threatened for his life somewhere in the world, he needs to find asylum in Europe. We cannot close our borders. We need to welcome those we can and have to welcome. Then we cannot welcome everybody. So we also need to protect our borders, and this is a business for the EU as a whole. And we need that combination of open society and secured borders, and to have a discourse on that which is still humanist. A Europe which wouldn't be humanist is not worthwhile. And we need to combat the populists through results, through delivery. And for that, we need also a bit of solidarity. If I look at the Italian situation, Italy is very much in my mind right now. I dislike what Mr. Salvini says. I think that's a way to handle politics that I combat, and I've combated that all my life. But there is also a root cause, is that the Italians, I'm not talking about him, but about the Italian people, feel they've been left alone in the front line of the migration crisis without solidarity from the other member states. So we need to create that solidarity. This is why we need to reform our asylum policy. We need to reform the so-called Dublin agreements, who left people or countries of the front line on their own. And we need to find a common policy there, which is at the same time open and secure.
Yeah, I mean, not to belabor this, but is there anything to learn from Germany's turn? I mean, Angela Merkel became very politically vulnerable after she, you know, kind of took solidarity seriously. So there are some dangers there.
I must say, but because it's my personal sensitivity, I have a great admiration for Madame Merkel for that. I'm not from a political family. She's a Christian Democrat, conservative, and I'm a social democrat, progressive. But I think that gesture was really something for which I have a great esteem, because she had the courage to say that in a society which was divided, with the reunification, which has been difficult, with people from Eastern Germany who still feel that they have not the same status of people from Western Germany. The problem is that probably it was not managed enough, and that, well, there was a backlash to that. But we must not condemn her for that, and I think she still is a strong leader. But of course, now we need to move to another stage, and the other stage is to combine open society and secure borders, and also to make sure that you cannot welcome everybody in Europe. We need to welcome those who have the status of asylum seekers, of refugees, but not everybody.
And listen, so you point out a moment ago that, to put it succinctly, that the legacy of the financial and economic crisis and the Great Recession is pretty much the driving force of, you know, this populist outbreak. And I'm wondering, well, I'm wondering whether that might be, there's a big debate in the United States over what the roots of the populist wave here are, and there are competing ideas, one being about, you know, economic anxiety, the other about being, say, ethnic anxiety, given the rise of minority populations and as well immigration, but also other drivers of minority population growth. So that's perhaps why I've stayed a little bit on migration. But the question really is it perhaps naive to think that by fixing the economics of Europe, say, in a way, you can put the toothpaste back in the tube? You can kind of like go back to the status quo ante? Or is this, you know, have we just crossed a river that we can't cross back?
This is the big question, and I wouldn't be so sure of my answer. Obviously, we have both. We've got economic anxiety, and we've got cultural anxiety. I'm more an economist than something else. Even I don't consider myself a great economist, but I've been in some economic posts for quite a while. And I consider that cultural anxiety basically comes from economic anxiety. And that's something that has been observed all over history. It's not the first time. We've seen that before World War I. We've seen that before World War II. And in a way, the situation we face in Europe looks a bit like the in-between two wars. Not totally, but and we also need to be careful with the history, but still, there are some resemblances. So I think that we need to address economic anxiety. What is economic anxiety? It's not only growth, because if that would be the case, you wouldn't have any problem in Germany. The German growth is bright for years, if not decades. Unemployment is low. External surpluses are booming. So you could consider, is there a problem in Germany? Yes, there is a problem with the growing concern of AfD, the extreme right party coming in the Bundestag, which is something terrifying when you think about that. So it's not about growth. It's probably about inequality. And inequality between countries, and that's why we must recreate convergence inside the Eurozone especially. There is inequalities between regions, and obviously if you look at Germany, between East and West. I'm not saying that the AfD is only in the East, but basically it's more on the East than on the West. western side of Germany. So I'm not saying that it's enough to put the toothpaste in the tube, but I think it's the minimum to try to bring some people to the conception of open economy and open society, because there is a crisis of delivery from the EU. Then you also need to address other cultural and political matters. I will just mention one. As you said, I'm an old guy from the establishment, so I was Minister of European Affairs 20 years ago. It was before enlargement. And probably because of my background, but also because I considered that after the fall of the Soviet Union, we had to reunify Europe, I was really pro-enlargement. I think that when you're in Warsaw, when you're in Budapest, we're in Prague, you're in Europe, and we had to do that. So I have no regret, no nostalgia from the situation before. And the answer is not to say we shouldn't have done that. But we need to reflect on the way we did it. And I think that something we didn't catch was that the prospect for reunification was not the same from the new countries than from the old countries. A Frenchman or a German have created Europe after 1957, but after World War II, because they wanted to go over nationalism and to create something that was called supranationalité. It was the concept, a kind of federalism, even without saying it. We wanted to build a European federation with our own tools. But people from the East, from the former Soviet bloc, their view was totally different. They had been deprived of their nationality for decades, and they wanted to recover it. And so we didn't create a common culture at this time. And we paid the price for it. Because I talked about Mr. Salvini, but there are other guys. When I think about Mr. Orban, I knew him 20 years ago when he was, for the first time, Prime Minister. He was already not very sympathetic, I must say, but different than today. Still, Mr. Orban considers that Europe has to be made only by white Christians. And obviously, this is a fake. This cannot be accepted. And all EU member states need to accept a part of the burden of migrations. We are not as the US, we're not as multicultural or as Canada, but still we need to accept that we have different cultures, that we have different religions, that you have people from different origins living in Europe. And that is true for the whole Europe, not for a part of Europe.
Yeah, yeah. Thinking about, maybe we shouldn't have thoughts. Marty Feldstein, an economist at Harvard, famously wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs when the euro was about to be launched, arguing that the euro would actually cause war. That this instrument that was being, designed supposedly as glue for economic glue for European countries would in fact cause a great deal of troubles between them. And I'm wondering that with the experience of the last few years behind us, what you would say of that assessment?
Wrong, I must say. Because euro didn't create war. And those countries which are inside the euro, they share the feeling that euro is good for them. Let's have a look at Italy again. We have hard time with the Italian government. We're going to have debates with them on their fiscal policy, on their budget, etc. But 75% of the Italians are feeling that they're better in the Eurozone than outside. I will take another example. In the last 6 years, I dedicated a lot of my time to Greece. First as finance minister of my country, then as commissioner. And when in 2015 a leftist government won in Greece, obviously their first move was to say, okay, we must not follow the rules, we can do something radically different. And it was the bright era of Mr. Varoufakis. But after a few months, Mr. Tsipras, the prime minister, who is a wise guy, realized that the Greeks wanted to stay in. So he found a different political course. What do I mean by that? I mean that euro is obviously a huge protection and a guarantee of stability for those countries who share it. And that there is, on the contrary, something that cements them. But still, where the Feldstein's words are true, is that we have not a complete euro already. That it is a protection, but that it doesn't create dynamism, that it doesn't create convergence, that it doesn't help us to reduce inequalities, and so that in the end, it might fail. We cannot be for sure that euro is there forever. We need to consolidate euro. We need to reform the eurozone. This is something absolutely necessary and decisive. And well, we are late in that prospect, and that's a source of worry for me. No, not war, but incomplete euro.
So thinking in this way, I'm wondering whether, again, thinking about how you've emerged from the crisis and how long it's taken and the costs it's entailed, would you, we can think about paths not taken, would you say that economic policy making throughout the crisis to keep the euro together, to keep everybody in, was ideal? I mean, because to some extent, I would blame some economic policy making in Europe for the kind of political outcomes that we're seeing today. The imposition of austerity early on, when perhaps a less austere policy might have served, especially in the peripheral countries, and in extremely harsh terms for, you know, Spain, Italy, Greece, that might have contributed to this great dissatisfaction that's manifesting in the politics.
I wouldn't say that it was ideal. Obviously, it was not. But you must realize that when the Eurozone was hit by the crisis in 2008, the euro was just born. It was born in 2002. And so at the time, we didn't have the tool to address such a crisis. We're not a federation. We're not a state. And we had to invent them during the crisis. And it was during the crisis that we founded the two-pack and six-pack legislation, which is dedicated to reduce deficits and debts by our member states. It's during the crisis that we created some financial tools as the economic stability mechanism, which is a kind of bazooka or financial bazooka, for example, to give loans to Greece. And it's over 290 billion euros loans which were given to Greece, granted to Greece. We also improved, as I said, the balance sheets of our bank. We helped them restructuring. We created a banking union, so the banking sector is now much more secure than it was. So we had to improvise. The big question is about austerity. There are two things I want to say on that. First, was there austerity in Europe? This is a big question. There was austerity for the people, and a lot of people suffered from the crisis. But if you look at the public finances, you cannot say that. Public debt is 30 percentage points higher in 2018 than it was in 2008. Is this austerity? Our budgets continued to grow. And the limit that we cannot go over or cross over is public debt. When you've got 170% percentage point public debt in Greece, well, it creates a crisis. When you've got 130% in Italy, you need to be careful about that. And so you cannot go over that. And we also had, and it's a social democrat saying that, to reform our pension systems because they were not sustainable, or to reform our labor market because they did not admit insiders. But of course, this doesn't make a progressive policy. And this part, reducing inequalities, obviously lacked. And this is what created the feeling of austerity. I wouldn't say differently, there was no global austerity, but there were growing inequalities. And those growing inequalities, of course, are unstandable for people. The unemployment rate is 4% in Germany, it's 9% in France, it's 15% in Spain, and it's 20% in Greece. And all those countries have the same currency. So, of course, you can understand that there is a dissatisfaction and that we cannot live forever with that. Yeah. And that we need more solidarity and to share the burden more. And that's why, again, I come back to reform of the Eurozone. We need to create a budget for the Eurozone in order to recreate or to create convergence inside the Eurozone. Because if you've got divergence growing divergences, growing inequalities. No, you're not going to war. But at one stage, the even existence of the euro will become fragile. You know, having a monetary union is an experience that has existed all over history. Some succeeded, not easily. The dollar became only the currency of this country after the Civil War. You must not forget that. And it was not that easy to go to the dollar. Some failed, and the euro is young. The euro, I think, is a success until now, but an incomplete success. And if we don't care that much in 15 to 20 years from now, it can finish. It can end. It's fragile. So we need to comfort it, we need to reform it, and we need to add the convergence part to the stability part.
Well, let's stay there for a second. I mean, you mentioned you need a common budget, and that would be the essential critique from economists on this side of the Atlantic of the architecture.
Also on the other side of
that
the Atlantic.
It was a monetary union without a fiscal transfers, without fiscal union is not going to work. What is the politics for it to create that seem to me not any easier than they have been. So do you see actually a path? What's the path that you see to establish that kind of fiscal transfer within the Eurozone?
It's hard. There are proposals from the Commission that we have delivered. There are proposals from France and Germany, but they need to be a bit clearer on the content of the proposals. There was a declaration between Chancellor Merkel and President Macron at Meseberg calling for a budget for the Eurozone. But now it's time to say how much, for what, and what would be the resources. But I think there is a path, and this path, I hope, can be now followed until the European elections, and if not, it must be followed after the European elections. I think that in the end we will go there because of as well economic, social, and political necessity. Because in the end, you cannot have a monetary union if you don't have at the same time a fiscal union and a political union. So we need now to upgrade the two other elements. We have got a monetary union. We need to upgrade the fiscal element, to upgrade the political element. And that's why I hope that after the difficult fight that we are going to have against the populists in the European elections and in the years to come, because it's not game over, we will get back to this path.
Yeah. And incidentally, is it right to understand all these new political forces as definitely anti-Europe? Or is there a variety of positions? Can you say put a proposal like what you're talking about now to any of these new political forces, or is it just a no that you're going to get?
There might be nuances between them, but they all have a common point, which is a bit different, is that they are in favor of illiberal democracy. Illiberal democracy means that it's democracy because you vote, but after the vote, you don't respect the rule of law. Michael Ignatieff, who was a political scientist, he is a political scientist and was a politician in Canada, wrote a piece about politics of the adversary and politics of the enemy. When you are combating your opponents, I've been in opposition, I've been in government, I've been, I would say 7 years basically in government and as many years in opposition. Well, I'm a social democrat, I combat the conservatives. We fight for the elections and then one of the blocs govern and the other is in the opposition. But we respect the opposition. Where you're inside the politics of the enemy, you consider that you have to destroy the one who are the opponents.
Now that's U.S. politics.
That's illiberal democracy. I use that word, which is Orban theory. And then you consider that your purpose is to keep power by any means. And you don't care about independence of justice. You don't care about independence of media. You're not reluctant to any kind of means. And this is certainly worrying. And this is a common point to all these forces. After that, they might have some different positions. I can imagine that at one stage we can discuss euro with our Italian friends, because that's a tradition. But we'll have other matters with them.
Okay. Well, so now thinking about
and their conception of euro is a bit different than the German one, for example.
Like how so?
Their commitment to the Stability and Growth Pact might be weaker.
Yes, yeah. So thinking...
They're not as ordo-liberal as in Berlin, probably.
Yeah, no, I'm sure.
But that's not totally new. Huh?
No. Indeed, Italians have had a different position to Germans on issues economic for a very, very long time.
You can say that.
Yeah.
But they also didn't have the same results. Because in Italy, which is a country I love, there are obviously structural reforms to pursue, because the main problem is not to have less or more deficit. The problem is productivity that needs to be enhanced.
Yeah. And so let me ask you about the future and solutions. And you identify inequalities as the main, say, problem besetting Europe. So what are the policies to address it? And if you would kind of like embed them in the politics, would be also helpful.
Well, there are national issues, because inequalities have to be addressed in all our member states, and you can there have policies which are as well dedicated to education. I think that's the most important, to raising skills, to helping individuals to get higher skills, and this has to be, of course, the investment of the future, and we need to invest on human capital. I would say that during the crisis we've made reforms. I would say 1.0 reform is labor market and pensions. We need to have now reforms 2.0, if not 3.0, and those reforms are dedicated to human capital, to investment, as well physical and intellectual investment, research, etc. There is a second tool which can be used nationally. It's taxation, and that is the classical way to consider redistribution. If you look at this redistributional impact, I must say the only country where inequalities have not been developed through the crisis, through taxation, is France. Maybe it has another cost for French growth, but it's quite clear. And then at the EU level, I come back to the euro. I'm a euro fan. I'm a euro fighter, not for the helicopter, but for fighting for the euro. And I truly believe that now we need to move resolutely to a complete euro. We must have a budget. You know, I'm not talking about budget federalism. Budget federalism, I think the federal budget of the US represents something like 10% of GDP. But do you know how much does the budget of the EU represent? 1% of GDP. That's absolutely ridiculous. And we need to have a budget for the Eurozone, which is significant. Is it going to be through grants or through loans? Can we develop our financial tools? We already have some, like the ESM. The ECB can also be active. So we'll see. But we need to have something there which helps reducing inequalities inside the Eurozone. And the Eurozone has to be dedicated to that, more than it was until now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I write often about inequality, and when I write about inequality in the American context, I normally, to put an example of how it could be done better, I tend to point to Europe. So it's kind of interesting to see you pointing that out as a problem.
To be very frank, I love the United States. I've been living there, I've been working there, I come there often. But there is a different model in Europe, obviously. If you consider EU as a whole and US as a whole, I'm not talking about New York. I'm talking about, because in a way it's quite European here. We are attached to open societies and open economies. We cannot stand death penalty. We are favoring gender equality. We have a very strict policy anti-discrimination until now. We are dedicating a lot of financing towards combating climate change. We are the first donors, and by far, in the context of the Paris Agreement. This is something to which we are attached, and it is under threat. And so I wouldn't like us to become totally like in this part of the Atlantic.
Yeah. No, but I find it interesting that a problem that in the United States seems to me much more extreme than it is in Europe there seems to be less.
Yes, but what I say is that there are tendencies in Europe which are backtracking
To move.
and moving in the wrong direction, obviously, and that's what populism is about. Obviously, those populism, those illiberal democracies, are a threat to the European values, to the European social model. And you know, we're living in a strange world. For the time being, the president of the United States is Donald Trump. I'm not going to comment, but obviously, it creates some tensions. Not only inside the US, but also with its partners. The president of China is Xi Jinping. The president of Russia is Vladimir Putin. And in this context, if you would reason, you would say there is another bloc or another region in the world which is economically wealthy, strong, with high purchasing power and with value. It's high time that Europe unites more to precisely combat for its own values. And it's the paradox, it's a time where Europe is threatened by fragmentation. And so I call the Europeans to unite more and to fight for their model, to be proud of it. It's not perfect. But if you compare yourself, you know, Talleyrand, who was a foreign affairs minister for a very long time during the revolution, before, after, said, when I look at myself, I feel sorry. When I compare, I console. So the Europeans should meditate that.
Yeah, yes. You mentioned when talking about tools to address inequality, you mentioned education, you mentioned redistribution to standard prescriptions. What is your assessment of the state of the support for redistribution within Europe, within European countries? And I'm thinking now specifically of Macron, but who is seen, at least on this side of the Atlantic, as perhaps the savior of Europe against the forces of populism. I'm not sure how he stands today. He seems to have lost much of his popularity, but he doesn't seem like an amazingly redistributive government, from what I can read. So I don't know. How would you characterize it?
I'm not anymore in French politics, so I've got to be very careful about that. Not to give the feeling that I'm in favor or opposing. So I would concentrate on the first part. Obviously, he wants to reform France in a way that gives more leeway. It's a very pro-business policy, and I don't think that redistribution is the first preoccupation for him. I think he believes that by creating more wealth, then you can have better social results. It's more on that side than on the traditional redistribution side. But obviously he's a pro-European, and that's an asset for Europe. The problem is that you need to be two to tango, and you cannot reform Europe on your own. You cannot be the only one making proposals. You need to have interlocutors. You need to find agreement, and you first need to have a Franco-German engine that works. My experience as a European politician is that the basis for progress in Europe is to have Paris, Berlin, Brussels aligned. And that's something that we must recreate.
Okay. So it's I thought, I had to ask you about Macron, to a French socialist,
Well, I'm a retired, for the time being, French politician. Not retired. I'm a bit looking at that from a wider perspective. Maybe someday I will come back, but for the time being, I'm well where I am.
Yeah. And listen, would you comment on how you see...
But I'm still a social democrat, so I've got my feelings.
Okay. But you won't tell us.
You can guess it. But I manage well with Emmanuel Macron. We work well on European matters. And, he's a guy who knows also what social democracy is. After all, he has been a minister in our own government also.
Yeah, yes.
And a lot of his advisors, ministers come from the center left. So the story has not ended in France. He's present for something like 16 to 7 months. And so the experience is just beginning.
Okay. Yeah.
And we cannot say precisely where it will lead in the years to come.
Yeah.
Obviously, for a Frenchman, He has to succeed one way or another because the populist threat is also there. Nobody must forget that in the second round of the presidential election, it was him versus Madame Le Pen. So there can be other democratic forces which can grow in the future, but we must stick to the combat against populism and far right in France. So it's better that if he succeeds, obviously.
Yeah. So perhaps I should ask you now about how you see the economic outlook for Europe and the conversation here. You start seeing some concerns bubbling up about, the length of this expansion. It's going to, start breaking records. Signs of overheating in certain asset markets, increasing amount of corporate debt. Worries that the fiscal stimulus that was just delivered by the Republican Party might, at some point overheat the economy. There's always the next crisis. And so I'm wondering how you would assess that.
If you look at, you're talking mostly about the global economy, not about EU economy. The global economy is doing well. And if I look at the forecast delivered by all international institutions, whether it is the IMF or the World Bank or the European Commission, we are all basically aligned by saying that world growth will be around 4% this year and the next year. If you look at the EU, I said that we have moved from crisis to recovery to expansion, moderate expansion, but our forecast is still around 2% for as well 18 and 19. After that, it's very difficult to forecast or to predict. If I look again at the EU economy, I would say the recovery is quite solid, and we think that it's well funded now. But all the economists point the fact that risks obviously are moving to the downside. And sorry to say that, the major risk is obviously trade. And we must absolutely avoid trade wars. Trade wars are not that easy to win, and they are absurd. They only create losers, and this is why we must absolutely find solutions through multilateralism. This is the main source of concern worldwide, and it's of course the main source of concern in Europe.
Yeah, well, so since you've opened that door, we definitely should walk through.
That because if you look at the downside and upside risks, of course, at one moment there will be a crisis. Of course, the cycle has been long, but if you look at the fundamentals of the cycles, they don't seem to be exhausted for the time being. And so, when the economists forecast growth for years to come, they don't see the end of it. 2 years from now.
Yeah.
But trade is like the elephant in the room. Until now, trade measures decided or announced by President Trump have not created an impact on the EU economy, for example, or a very weak impact on the world economy. But it's a threat for the future. It's a risk.
Yeah. Yes. No. So I definitely wanted to get there about relations between Europe and the United States, given our parallel political developments. How do you give me some scenarios? How do you see this moving forward? We're in a moment of calm now, it seems.
The US and the EU have common interest, and they don't have any good reason to fight each other as far as trade is concerned. There have been some precisely measures announced. There was a reaction from us. Then there was a discussion between President Trump and President Juncker, President of the European Commission, which basically went well. I saw Jean-Claude Juncker, who was in town yesterday morning. He was supposed to meet Donald Trump yesterday night. For some odd reasons, they seem to be getting along quite well. I mean, odd because, well, why not? Why him and why not another? I can understand because, in a way, Jean-Claude is also a very outspoken politician that might be appreciated humanly by President Trump. I don't know President Trump well. I met him in some G20 meetings also, but not directly. And well, we are entering into negotiations that won't be easy, but we need to find a way. anyhow, we, the Europeans, we still believe in multilateralism, and we think that trade wars must be avoided with anybody, not only between us and the US, but also between the US and China. And I hope that we will be capable of finding a way.
Yeah. If you could tell us a little bit about what are these negotiations?
No, they're just starting.
About? I mean, because it seems to me that it's unclear what the expected outcomes are.
It's not already clear. So it's just starting. But I mean, the spirit is there, and the timetable is there, and so the agenda is being set now. There have been, I think, 2 or 3 meetings between the Trade Commissioner, my colleague Cecilia Malmström, and Mr. Lighthizer. Let them work.
And by the way, is there any concern, or maybe it takes pressure off Europe, over the part of the trade war that does seem to be heating up, which is the part of the United States and China?
Yes, I said that. This needs to be carefully monitored.
How could that, sideswipe Europe, say?
Well, we're not anticipating that for the timing. As I said, there has been no impact. The impact might be worldwide. That's why, again, we must come back to the table of multilateralism. I believe that these discussions must be addressed between the G7 members, and China is not around the table, and between the G20 members. Yeah. And China is there.
Yeah. I think this is.
And there will be a G20 summit in Buenos Aires in November, and I hope it will be the occasion to reiterate a common commitment to fighting protectionism. Protectionism is not a solution for any of our countries.
I find that this particularly interesting because trade now is so much about supply chains that are essentially deployed around the world, and so I can see that something that looks like a bilateral dispute would ultimately affect production chains in all around the world, including
absolutely. That's again why it's work in progress, but we cannot move to those trade wars. Again, that's a lose-lose situation. Obviously.
No, I think that pretty much most economists in this country would agree with you, and yet
so
policy is moving in a okay. So other than trade, what is the European? I mean, and trade is the elephant in the room, but what is on the bilateral agenda on your book?
Well, basically things are quite fine. We are very strong partners and allies. When I look at the US tax reform, I don't have much comment to deliver on that. Maybe we can have some WTO discussions for this or that measure. We are discussing that with our American friends. I will meet Stephen Mnuchin here tomorrow. But we are cooperating quite well. We have this elephant in the room, which is trade. That's basically it. Yeah. It's a good relationship. Yeah.
So the tax reform, despite its intent to...
Tax reform is a matter of sovereignty for the United States. We'll have to see whether it's good for the American economy, not this year or next year, but in the middle term, what kind of effects it can produce. There is a debate there. But again, we are not discussing that. We might have, again, 1 or 2 matters that could go to WTO, which are already mentioned, like intellectual property. We are discussing that with the American authorities, but we don't have a great deal of comment on that. Okay. We might have some feelings or analysis, but
and I was wondering.
Well, I'm not so sure that it will produce growth forever.
Yes, I was also wondering about. There has been in the past, and maybe this is getting too much into the weed, friction over antitrust policy in Europe has caused some heartburn in the United States. And I wonder if that is something that your American counterparts bring up. If that has that been an active issue?
The antitrust policy in Europe is as independent as it is in the US. It's not a matter of it cannot be used politically. It's a matter of policy, not of politics.
Yeah. But it has been perceived as a specific attack against some American companies, and so hence.
I want to be clear on that. Let's move to digital. I'm Commissioner for Tax, and I'm the guy who proposes that there is a limited but clear and significant digital taxation in Europe. And this, I know, has been perceived by some here as anti-US. It is not the case. We are not targeting GAFAs. I never talk about a GAFA tax. I'm talking about a proper taxation of digital economy because we need to identify what digital presence means for companies, for our corporates, because I think we need to have a minimal taxation on that. And this is a point we discuss with our American friends. We are not anti-US, we are not protectionist. Neither is the antitrust policy. It happened that some companies have been, in some cases, let's mention, for example, Apple in Ireland, but it's not because it was American. It's just because there was a problem of so little taxation that it has been assimilated by my colleague Margaret Vestager, who is in town, as a state aid. And this is something which is contrary to our own legislation. But we are not in the idea of creating any trouble with the US. We're just wanting our own legislation to be respected with our own tools. And it doesn't matter whether the company is American or Asian or etc.
Yeah.
But it happens also that the internet giants are mostly Americans.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, I mean,
so it's not because they're Americans. It's because some practices have to be corrected. And we discussed that with them too. No, it's not a problem between it must not be a problem between the US and EU.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if you'll have a comment about this, but there is a debate over, kind of like a more intellectual debate over the scope of antitrust policy, in which Europe seems to have taken a very different, trajectory, a different stance than most antitrust economists in the United States. So you talk about, I was at an antitrust conference the other day and asked about Vestager, and eyes start rolling. Because it's considered like very ham-fisted. It's just going after big companies. It's not looking out for the consumer. It's unsophisticated and so forth. So I was wondering whether
I'm not a specialist in that.
Oh, okay.
She's the commissioner in charge.
No, okay.
Next time you invite her, and she will.
But in any event, antitrust is not something that you would consider like a.
I don't consider that we have an ideological or political approach of antitrust. I think that, of course, we are entering into uncharted territories until now for the reason that there is a new economy growing, but that we still have the same philosophy. I don't see a major change there.
Okay. Now, I was interested in hearing you talk about the reforms as you see necessary as Europe goes forward, and talking about deepening integration, perfecting the euro. And talked about inequalities. In the United States, in the context of the conversation about inequality, there is this sense that partly given the difficulties in increasing redistribution here, one should start thinking about market mechanisms to increase equality. And so a lot of the conversation is, well, how are labor markets working, and are there ways to make them work better? So one strand of this research goes about are labor markets becoming monopsonistic, such that wage bargaining becomes much more difficult and more in favor of the corporation. Another line of research is going into the use of outsourcing and whether that is fissuring labor markets in a way that's increasing inequality. Now, when I think about when you talk about labor market reforms in Europe, I think you're thinking about something kind of entirely different to that. It's more like reducing, or at least the history of this conversation in Europe seems to me to have been more about reducing barriers for businesses to hire and fire. But I wonder if you think about inequality, you could think in these different terms.
That's clear that it was the basic philosophy, because precisely that was the problem. The other parts are well developed. Also, I think that there is room now for wage increase in Europe, because we've got growth without inflation, and so for wage bargaining too. But still, for example, we have also very strong unemployment insurance schemes. Some we might create at the European level. The European national ones are quite developed, so it's a bit different, because I think the initial situation is quite different.
Yes, yes. But
That's again the social model of Europe, which is a bit different. Our social security net, safety net, are stronger than the US, obviously.
oh yes, definitely.
We would have had the debate about Obamacare.
No, well, no. But maybe you had that like 50 years ago.
Yeah, that's what I mean. We've got healthcare systems that are, you can judge, depends on your appreciation of Obamacare or healthcare systems, but ours are quite securing.
Yeah. But in your assessment of the changing political situation, do you see the possibility that Europe's social safety net is literally, reduced, eroded, dismantled?
Dismantled, certainly not. Eroded, it has to be avoided. Reformed is possible. Then you were talking about Macron. That's probably one of the things he plans to do for France. And these are things that have been starting before. The question is the balance there, and that we must absolutely avoid, again, increasing inequalities.
Yeah. Okay. So
you need to reform those systems, but to maintain the capacity to redistribute and to combat inequalities.
Yeah. So in this sense, is pension reform that is going on? Do you see that as roughly over, or is there still?
Roughly, yes. Roughly doesn't mean totally, but.
So what is still? So
No, I mean, if again I move to. All European countries have reformed their pension system. Why? Because it was very costful and financially unsustainable in a situation of demographic lowering. So we had to consider that. Then some countries like my own, France, still plan to reform the pension system, but not for financial purposes, but to reform it structurally, to introduce new parameters. But I would say that the financial reforms of the pension systems basically have been done.
Okay.
Even if you need to adapt them. Adapt them how? Well, the life perspective is much better now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And it's acceptable that when you live longer in better health, that when you start working later, that you contribute for a bit longer. The 60 years old retirement age in France is something which is still legal, but if you look at the average age of retirement is 62.5, and it will go on increasing slowly, but securely, and this probably had to be pursued. I don't expect to retire next year.
Yeah. You're going to be 60 next year?
I'm 61 already.
Oh, okay, all right. So listen, but
if you're an old-timer, you're an old-timer by all means. That's the problem. For myself, I cannot even realize that. I cannot stand it, but that's the fact.
Yeah. No,
but I just had a baby this summer, so I feel younger.
You're feeling young. But here, that's an interesting question. The politics of French pensions have been very complicated. I remember back in the when Sarkozy was president, this was extremely costly for him, an attempt just to lengthen the retirement age. So that seems to me that there's still some difficult political work to do if that is going to become.
It's always costful, and that's why probably we are having partial reforms, and this time President Macron also have a structural one. We'll see.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah.
That's the next big political debate in France.
Okay. So hang on. This point that I'm really interested in. You mentioned that the European population is getting older. In some countries, it's shrinking, and just this makes me circle back to migration. Is there, in the conversation about migration, is there any thought of that? Europe at some point is going to need a younger labor force from outside its borders, to do the bedpans and so on for the older Europeans.
Economists and policymakers know that obviously we have a need for immigration in Europe. Not everywhere, but in some, as you said, shrinking population, states. Today, population of Germany is something like 80 million people, and France is 66. If you project the demographic trends, and I try to contribute to that, France is going to have a higher population in 2050 than Germany. And so that means that the population in Germany is shrinking, while demography is in much better state in France. So it's quite logical that at one moment, our countries globally, and some specifically, consider having more immigration. And so economists and policymakers theoretically can consider that, but obviously we're in a situation where the population cannot accept it. And that's one of the paradoxes of the European history at the time being.
Yeah. And
so probably the one who would go in the public debate saying we need more migrants would have just a success of esteem, as we say in French.
Yeah. And if you put it that you are, well, there's the Mediterranean in the middle, but right on the other side of the Mediterranean, you have some of the countries with the fastest population growth and the fastest growth in the young population. It makes for projections of very, very intense migration in the coming decades. I mean, especially if you add on climate change and poverty.
Yeah, we're going to have to address those fluxes because you mentioned climate change. Climate change will also be a main driver for migrations. And Africa, of course, has a booming demography. It's a continent with a high growth now. I'm really an African fan. I consider that Africa is one of the futures of world growth and one of the futures of humanity. It was not only the place where humanity was born, it's also a future of humanity. So we need to take great care of Africa and to help Africa develop. And that's why also in the EU we've developed financial tools which are capable of bringing more development in Africa, meaning what we call the Compact for Africa, which was designed in the framework of the G20 under the proposal of the former finance minister of Germany, Wolfgang Schäuble. But also we are building tools through the European Investment Bank to help financing projects in Africa. If we want to also manage the migration issue properly, we need to give Africans their chance to have a future where they live. And I think that's something that is the missing part of what I said about migration, maybe the most important.
Yeah.
Thank you for helping me correct that.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you very much. I think it's now time to open the questions, open it up to the floor and see if you have any questions. Sir, here in front.
And if you do have a question, just state your name and your affiliation.
Can I have a glass of water?
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much. Paolo Mastrorilli, US correspondent with the Italian daily La Stampa. You were talking about Italy. There are conflicting news about the budget, 2%, 3%. What do you expect and what are you worried about?
Thank you. Yesterday, I was having dinner, invited also to this chamber, in a Venetian restaurant. And I thought that my relationship with the Italian press was not serenissima. And it's strange, everywhere I go, anywhere in the world, anywhere in Europe, I see some Italian journalists, and I'm very happy to see them. They are well organized, and they are all curious about the same matters. And I can understand that. Well, to have a more substantial answer, Italy is the third economy of the Eurozone. It's a core Eurozone country, and it's a founder of Europe. And so I think that the future of Italy is to be a credible country inside the Eurozone. And for that, Italy must respect the criteria, the parameters, the rules that have been set for everybody. These rules are enshrined into the Stability and Growth Pact. And what do they say? They say that first, all our countries need to be under 3%. That's the nominal threshold. And second, that they need to reduce their structural deficit, which is the case course for Italy because of its high public debt. So that's why I consider that the figures given, 3%, it's not reasonable. 2%, it's over the threshold if you look at structural deficit. So we'll see what the budget will be. It will be discussed, I think, Thursday by the government. I'm having constant talks with Minister Tria, who seems to be very conscious of the European duties of Italy. And then we'll have exchanges in the framework of the European semester. The European semester is a process starting with the submission of the draft budgetary plan of all euro area member states to the Commission, especially to myself as a Commissioner in charge of budget surveillance. And we have several procedural tools. I hope that Italy will be conscious that it has to fulfill the rules, the common rules. And this means not only respecting nominal deficit, but also reducing structural deficit. That's why, for example, when I read the comparison with France with 2.8%, no, that's not the point. The point is about structural deficit. And the structural deficit must leave Italy well under 2%.
Sir in the back?
Yeah, we have François here.
Yeah, Monsieur Moscovici.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. François from Banque de France. Although my question is more coming from a European citizen than the central bank. In your description of the state of Europe, I see some tension between what I would qualify as the EU level and the Eurozone level in terms of governance, especially with Brexit, which we didn't address, but which is an issue also. So how do you see these two levels coordinating, articulating, and which one is more strategic going forward?
They are complementary. We all are members of the European Union. We all share the single market. A lot of matters have to be addressed through the EU framework. Let's think about migration, even if we've got the Schengen agreements and everybody is not in Schengen. We've got some policy tools which are common to all 27. The Commission has some specific mission. Antitrust is a Commission mission. Trade is a Commission mission. Agriculture is a Commission mission. Or budget surveillance is a Commission mission. That's EU. Then we've got the Eurozone, 19 member states, and they have created progressively their own rules, the semester, which has to be, again, the common framework for all countries. This includes Italy, of course, the two-pack and six-pack legislation, the European Stability Mechanism, and this creates a proper set of rules. So I don't see a contradiction between both. And everybody must remember that theoretically, the future of all EU member states is inside the euro at one moment. That's why we must be equipped to welcome new members from the EU. That doesn't mean that everybody is forced to join, but we must be ready to welcome everybody with proper criteria. The question, which is maybe the most delicate, is how to decide to reform the Eurozone. Should we decide that at 19, or must we decide that in the framework of the 27? Is there going to be a treaty change? Some might be necessary, but if there is a treaty change, it has to be decided not only by the 19, because it's not a specific treaty, etc. And so this is a bit of a technical matter. I consider that the euro is core Europe, but that is not contrary to or contradictory to EU belonging. On the contrary.
So there's a guy back there.
Craig Millett from Branson Group. Could you comment a little more on the challenges of trying to implement a EU-wide VAT system and the pathway to try and get there, as well as the criticism that VAT doesn't do anything to address income inequality?
That's one of my big tasks, is to reform the corporate tax system in Europe and also the VAT system. The problem with VAT is that the system is quite fragmented and that it's not fraud-proof. On the contrary, we have the idea that we have got a huge revenue loss. We have a figure of something like 147 billion euros for this year, that we've got a massive fraud which is due to the fact that we are crossing borders, that we don't have the same treatment through borders. We have created a temporary regime for VAT in 1993. A temporary regime that lasts 25 years is becoming permanent, and I think it's not the good one. So we have made proposals, a lot of proposals, on e-books, on reduced rates, on cross-borders VAT, for a definite regime of VAT, which are on the table of the Council, and I think that they should be theoretically adopted. The problem is the decision-making on taxes, which has to go through unanimity, and obviously there are a lot of resistances. So I'm afraid I will finish my mandate with this reform, but I hope that we've set the foundations, but it's still work in progress.
Sir?
So fragmentation and fraud are the two main issues for VAT, although it's still a very robust and efficient tool for our public treasuries, let's be clear.
Hi, Rodolfo Costanzo, JP Morgan. Quick question on banking union and fragmentation. There is a lot of talk about EDIS and the evolution and the full creation of a banking union. But I want to leave that to one side for a second. How much, and instead focus on how much work is there being done on some of the issues that may still be more of a low-hanging fruit, like, for example, excess RWA, more technical issues such as excess charges on cross-border lending that you're currently seeing, that apart from EDIS may be one of the actual barriers to create a true banking union?
I'm not the Commissioner for Financial Stability, so I cannot address the very technical issues. I will give maybe a broader overview. 6 years ago, in 2012, we decided to create a banking union. There was nothing like that. And banking union has to be composed of 3 elements. The first one is banking supervision. It is there, works well, and it was a great help for us to restructure the balance sheets and to help those banks which were in a difficult situation to do so. The second one is resolution. We have created a single resolution fund. One of the problems that need to be addressed in the coming months is to give a backstop to this single resolution fund. And the third issue is EDIS, Deposit Insurance Scheme, which I think is a clear necessity. It's the third pillar of the banking union. And we know that we have a clear reluctance, resistance, a refusal for the time being from our German friends. I hope that we are going to open that, and we need to open that. We still believe that EDIS is necessary. But I've heard about that, but I cannot, the precise technical question, but sorry, I cannot give the concrete answers up to date on the works on that. This is not a major source of concern from the EU level.
Hey, Antoine de Namur from APCO Worldwide. So I've got a question for you. When you look at Portugal, for instance, or when you look at Sweden, you see that there is actually no correlation between economic crisis or even economic inequalities, as you mentioned, and the rise of populism or xenophobia or even identity politics. So what is your take on this, and what are you think the other reasons for instance, the emergence of xenophobic tendencies in Sweden that is doing quite well with great nets and a welfare system that is praised across the European Union, and the absence of such tendencies in Portugal that was really harshly hit by the crisis in 2008.
I'm not denying the importance of politics themselves, of history, or of social structures. If I look at the European spectrum, I see 3 countries which until now have been protected by the massive rise of populism. These are Portugal, Spain, and Greece in a way, although there is a neo-Nazi party, but it's something like 6 to 9%. which is in European standard is not that bad, although they are probably the worst party all across Europe. And it might be a paradox, since as well Portugal, Spain, and Greece has been badly hit by the crisis. So why so? Maybe because there are countries which are exposed for a long time to migration, which are Mediterranean, and second, because there is still in the brain of those people the remembrance of what the absence of democracy means. Because just 40 years ago, there was a dictatorship as well, and for a long time, in Spain, in Portugal, and in Greece. And this is clearly something which is still there. For Sweden, the rise of racism in the society, the absence of cultural combat, and also the existence of inequalities. Because, you know, the problem with inequality is when you've got a very equalitarian system, the diminishing of it, the attacks to welfare state create the feeling, which is marginal, that inequalities are raising even more. And Sweden today is no more the social democrat paradise it was 30 years ago. There has been some reforms which created this feeling, I think. So it does not infirm my thesis. Not totally. But you know, racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism are not things that are only created rationally. There are some things that are in the mindset of people, of some people. That has to be combated. But it existed always and will always exist. The problem is the fact that it becomes mass tendencies or mass movements. In France, we always had extreme right. In 1965, the General de Gaulle was first elected with an extreme right guy, was Texier-Vignancourt. He was 5%. 5% is, I would say, the minimal threshold of those who are haters of foreigners, who are fascists, etc. 5% is one thing. 16% is another one. 20% still. 30% is more than a worry. And after 30%, you worry. Big worry.
Giovanni Mainoni, Banca d'Italia. On EU trade relationship with China, the question is not there some kind of contradiction in the fact that a common market area does not speak with one voice, with joint trade, say, mission, and instead the trade and negotiation are generally done at the national level? So is there, in your opinion, a way in the current global debate, say, on the reform of WTO or other elements which regard China, Europe could speak with one voice?
But Europe speaks with one voice on trade specifically. Trade is not a national matter. Trade is dealt by the Commission. The only trade negotiator is the Commission. President Juncker, when he speaks to his counterparts, and Cecilia Malmström, when she speaks with her, that's a point where we are united. But of course, we need, the Commission is not is independent, but it's also interdependent. We also rely on mandates given by the Council. We cannot act totally in secret. It's not good. There is a need for transparency, and we need also to have political control. But that's the way it operates. No, on this, we are very united.
Rachel Ziemba from the Center for New American Security. I wanted to ask a question about another transatlantic irritant that I recognize is not fully in your responsibility set, which are sort of dynamics between the US and European Union on Iran, and particularly sanctions. But I'm curious for your thoughts about any implications for over the longer term around development of new payment systems, or just even, given the comments that you made earlier and very, very insightful ones about European values and institutions and the like, I'm curious as to sort of your thoughts and European priorities here, both between the US and EU, but also the fact that this, again, is another area where there's Commission level work and member state implementation. I recognize it's uncharted waters, so you may not be able to share too much.
No, it's not uncharted waters. It's not in my portfolio, but of course this is a matter we discuss. You know, the Commission is a college. That means that we exchange views each Wednesday, like in a government, and well, we're supposed to be informed on all those matters, and especially we discuss that each week. Again, I've been a minister in my own country quite recently, and I also followed those matters. We have a different view than the Trump administration on the Iran deal. Our view is that it's not perfect, that it can be improved, but that it is an agreement that was basically good and had to be respected but improved. That would be our motto. So we are not in favor of destroying it, and we are not also in favor of the sanctions that are imposed for our business to operate there. And this is why my colleague Federica Mogherini said no longer than yesterday, I think that we are trying to build tools in order to be capable of operating there. And this is why also President Juncker, in his State of the Union speech, that's one point we copy on the United States. We now have a State of the Union speech. We also have a State of the Union speech in France now. Okay. That's a good tradition in a way. Said that we need to reflect on the development of the euro as an international currency for exchanges, and especially in that case. And we are going to do so. So that's my response.
Interesting. Matt Droz from the Droz Group. You know, I deal a lot with African nations, and you really piqued my interest when you mentioned Africa. Because, you know, that it went from Japan, Taiwan, you know, for the labor markets. Now companies I deal with are looking at Vietnam, Thailand. But Africa's the sleeping giant, you know, and their big issues are population is below the 30s. You know, healthcare they're looking at. Prime Minister, President of Kenya is looking at housing, energy. France funded an energy program in Togo. What do you see the EU's role, you know, in Africa when you had said we have to help them to develop? In which ways do you see that? And what do you see within the EU, how they're doing that, and what you're doing?
If you look at our budget, I said it was very modest, but when it looks to development, we are the first funders in the world, and by far, to development. We are funders to development through the EU budget and also through our national budgets. And it happens that even in times of budget restrictions, all member states are now developing their budget. France, for example, is doing so. And I think that's a very good point because we're conscious because of a variety of reasons, we need to do so. Economic, human, and also the migration issues. And at the European level, we're also developing specific tools. Those tools are developed between those national promotional banks, which are dedicated to development, and also through our bank, our European bank, which is the European Investment Bank. In 2014, when this commission was created, we made the diagnosis that Europe suffered from a lack of investment. And we launched a plan, which is called the Juncker Plan, and we created a fund, the Strategic Fund for Investment, the European Strategic Fund for Investment, or for strategic investments, which delivered up to 335 additional billions of investment. And in the framework of this fund, we create also an FSI2, which is dedicated to Africa. And we are going to merge all these funds into what we call Invest EU in our next generation of budget. And we are going to target that to Africa. So through European budget, through national budgets, through national promotional banks, through EIB, we need to create a very massive financial bazooka dedicated to development in Africa. We are already doing that, and we want to improve our tools, to concentrate them, to make them more coordinated than they are today, so that they can be more efficient. Because as you said, sleeping giant.
That's a favored nation. They're favored nations.
They're the future of humanity.
Yeah.
So I think we have
that
time
continent
for
of the future, not sleeping giant.
So I think we have time for one more question.
There's very back.
Thank you. Lucinda Creighton is my name. I'm a former Irish Minister for European Affairs, and I run a public affairs business in Brussels and Dublin. A question, I suppose, that is connected to innovation and economic development. And it relates to the Capital Markets Union, which has kind of stalled, I would say, in the last couple of years. And, you know, I think if we're talking about an innovative, dynamic European economy, it's absolutely essential. I'd love to hear your thoughts on where it's going and whether it can be revitalized.
I think this Commission has launched the basis of the Capital Market Union, that it's a project that we still follow, that it's clear that we have lost a bit of pace in that, and that we need to relaunch it. But I cannot say something more specific because obviously we are in the last phase of this Commission. And when I look at the policy agenda, well, it's something which is on the background, but not on the front line. What are we going to be dedicated during the year to come? Brexit. We spoke very little about Brexit. But of course, it's a major source of political concern, if not economic concern. We're going to concentrate on migration. We are going to concentrate on economy, on the respect of the Stability and Growth Pact, on development of Eurozone, on digital taxation. These are, I would say, the main priorities. Capital Market Union is still there as a background and structural project. But I think it will be up to the next Commission and next European Parliament and next European Council to move forward in an even more decisive way. But we've set the basis.
Oh, thank you. I was remiss not to ask you about Brexit. Is it going to happen?
Yes. Well, I say yes. We all in the Commission regret the vote of the British people. We all respect the vote of the British people. And I see that when the 29th of March 2019 approaches, debates are starting. I just read something early this morning about the Labour Party conference saying that, well, they do not exclude staying inside the EU. But, well, if you look at the odds or the chances, let's say that the high likelihood of the Brexit to intervene is very, very high, because there has been first a referendum, there have been then some legal decisions taken, the negotiation is in its last phases, so the question is, how is this negotiation going to end? And there, well, we have several scenarios, let's hope for the best. Yeah. But it might be quite tough times, not because the EU is divided on that. We are very united and very firm, but because the political spectrum in the UK is quite complex, I would say. And there is the most important difficulty. Well, I hope that we can find a deal. The Commission is dedicated to find a deal. We're negotiating with that sole idea in mind, but we're not totally unconscious that it might prove difficult. So we are doing our best. We'll have a European summit in November, and hopefully we'll find a deal at this moment. But this deal, which is doable, needs then to be ratified by the British Parliament. And well, the experts in British politics are looking at all scenarios. Yeah, yeah. And we have all become the experts in British politics. Also in American politics. Yeah, well. And in Italian politics. But in politics everywhere. The only country where I'm not an expert now is French politics. Okay. Because I don't understand what happened, and so I've got to be very modest.
Well, listen, thank you very much for being here with us. Thanks a lot. It was great.